We're going to introduce Karla Melgar. Karla is the small acreage management specialist for Front Range region. She's been doing this since January of this year. Moved here from Nebraska, where she did research on manure management and soil health. She has experience working with nutrient management for livestock facilities. And Karla is going to talk about revegetation of pasture land. So I'll get your presentation pulled up for you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Karla, and I'm used to dealing a lot with small acreages and people who just bought land. And so one of the main issues that people have when I go and do site visits with them is having not enough grass, but wanting to work towards that and wanting to revegetate an area and get a more sustainable landscape, either for their cattle or just for recreation. So I'm going to focus a lot on some aspects that you can think about if you're trying to reseed an area or just trying to revegetate an area in a more sustainable way. And so I guess the most important thing to remember is that grasses are so important in Colorado. There's over 32 million acres of agricultural land in Colorado, and 71% of that is rangeland. And so that gives us an idea of the weight that grasses have for us. They're feeding us and they're feeding our cattle, and it's a big part of the ranch culture around the state. So beyond being that source of food for livestock and other domestic animals, grasses provide forage for wildlife and habitat and soil stabilization, like you were just hearing before. And there's many other benefits. So thinking about some things that you can do if you need to fix poor ground coverage with grasses. There's a couple questions that I think you should start thinking about before choosing a course of action. And so one of them would be, why is the ground bare? Is it something that is happening because of the management of the land? So overgrazing history, even if you were part of it or not, a lot of people who just bought land have to face that issue. Drought has been a big issue for the last few years, so that's going to be another thing that may or may not change. Are your soils poor in nutrients, or are they too basic and things like that? And then after you thought about some of those things, just think about, why are you unhappy with that pasture? Why are you wanting to change what you have? And so it's important to think about, if it's too weedy, then there might be some steps that you can take before reseeding and doing things like that. Is the grass too thin? Is it not performing enough? Is it not giving enough forage for your cattle? So those are things that are going to guide the course of action. Some of the land limitations that you may have that are making your soils a little poor and not giving you enough grasses could be the soil type, that it's not the most adequate for the type of grass that you have. There might not be enough precipitation, and that's changing. In general, you can have an average of how much precipitation is in your area, but that changes a lot. The climate, the altitude, the slope, the rocks, things like that can make a big difference in terms of what way to renovate your land. So it's important to, before you start, make a land assessment and make sure that you have those things identified. And so some options that you may have for a pasture that is not in their healthiest state is, either you can change some of the soils some of the factors that are affecting your soil coverage, like maybe you can change your grazing methods, or maybe you can do a little bit more of a weed management. And if that is the main issue with a pasture, you can probably reseed with the same species that you already have, if you still have them. But there's other things that you cannot change, like elevation and average temperature and things like that. So maybe consider other plants that are more suited for that area. And so we already talked a little bit about some of those factors that are limiting the type of grasses that you can grow in your land. So let's skip that. And there are some available tools that are going to help you choose the best seeds for you. So the first thing that I like to do when someone's interested in reseeding with something different is the soil web survey. So this is a tool from NRCS where you can draw your property and it will tell you a lot of things about it, but the main thing that you're probably gonna want to know after this is what types of soils you have. And all types of grasses will have different requirements in terms of soil types and drainage and things like that. So this is a great point where you can start and have an idea of what you're working with. And if you get very deep into it, you can find out like the natural vegetation that grows in your area, for example, and things like that. It's called ecological regions. So you're gonna find like that composition of grasses that naturally occur in there. But you don't have to get that deep into it. You can just figure out what soil type you have and what grasses need.
Where did you find that site?
It's called Soil Web Survey. So you can just Google it and it's gonna pull up. So yeah, I think I put a link at the end of the presentation for it. So some of the keys, if you already decided that what you need to do is to seed something different, will be to choose a seed that adapts to your wants and needs. So if you're feeding cattle, you're gonna want a higher producing grass, and some of the limitations that you may have. So you need to start, I feel like, by controlling the weeds in your property before either considering that your grasses are gonna recuperate from years of overgrazing and things like that, or if you're wanting to do a whole reseeding project, weed control is gonna be key for that. And then the seed choice, the seeding date, the seed quality, and the seed bed preparation, seeding placement are all things that are gonna play a big role into making that reseeding more successful. So first thing, weed management and identifying weeds is probably the most important part, and you may not need to know exactly the scientific name of each weed, but there are some things that you're gonna want to know so that you can make a better use of your time and your money. So if you are able to identify whether a weed is annual or not, that's gonna be a very important first step. You don't wanna be spraying weeds when they're already past that seeding production stage, not annual weeds at least, because you're already, those weeds are already about to die, pretty much. And then creeping perennials are gonna require different management. And then if you have annual grasses, that's gonna make that whole weed management process a lot harder, because you might not find the herbicides that work better for those. And then seed choice, there's a typo there. Seed choice, it's important. You need to know what seeds grow in your area. So again, look at your soil type, look at your climate, your elevation, and choose plants that are better adapted for that. And then after you find out what grass type you need for your area, make sure that you get good seed quality. So you can buy probably a cheap seed mix that is not gonna fulfill some of those standards that I put in there. So you're gonna want a good germination, purity. You're gonna want a seed mix that doesn't have that many other seeds from crops or weeds in it. And you wanna make sure that those seeds have been tested within the last 9 months so that you can make sure that this company is actually selling you a good product. Seeding date is gonna play a big role too, and you're basically gonna have 2 time frames during the year when you can do that. And so after you've already controlled the weeds in your property, then you can have this option of choosing whether you're gonna do a dormant seeding or a spring seeding. So a dormant seeding is usually done in the fall, and it's usually after the temperatures have cooled down enough that your seeds are not gonna start germinating in the early days of the winter, because that would probably kill some of your grasses. And then you can also choose a spring seeding, which is whenever temperatures have warmed up enough that the grasses can take advantage of some of that moisture from the snow melt and things like that. So then seed placement is also very important, and it's something that depending on what type of equipment you may or may not control. Seeding or placing the seeds too deep into the soil will cause your seeds to use a lot more energy just trying to emerge out of the soil and not producing enough of the leaves that are actually feeding the plant. The ideal depth for a seeding is between 1.5 and 2.5 inches. And then if you do it too shallow, then you're exposing some of the roots, and that's going to be a little bit harder to establish because you're going to have that incidence of erosion or wind or animals trying to rip your seeds off of the ground. And so a lot of that seed placement is going to depend on your seeding equipment. So some of the most common options are the ones you're seeing there on the screen. So broadcast seeding is usually pretty easy, pretty cheap. You can do it, but you're going to want to use double or triple the seeding rate because you have to assume that you are going to lose some of those seeds because of what I said before. Your seed might be a little too shallow in the soil. And then what you want to do for that is till before you place your seeds and then drag or pack the soil after you place them so you can make sure that you have a good seed to soil contact, but also protect them a little bit from the environment. A cultipacker is also a pretty good tool to use. You're probably also going to need to till your seed bed, and that's going to allow the seeds to stay in the soil a little better. Cultipacker would do a little bit better in terms of providing that soil to seed contact, but you're still going to want to drag or pack after seeding. And then you can also find drill seeders, which can help you directly plant the seeds into the soil. And you're also going to need to till the seed bed, and you need to use a drill that's specifically made for grass seeds. So if you use a grain drill, you're probably putting those seeds too deep into the soil. So just one thing to keep in mind. And usually a no-till drill seeder is pretty successful for grasses. It allows you to seed on top of existing vegetation. It reduces erosion, so it gives you a little bit more of that organic matter that stays on the soil after you replace the crop, or if you decided to mow your weeds and things like that, they're going to stay in there and they're going to hold some of your seeds. So again, after you've identified what tools you have for reseeding, do some seedbed preparation. If the land is irrigated, you're going to want to make sure that even if the ground is not, if it's not possible to get your ground level, then maybe you can work around that and make sure that you're using the right seeding rates for that area that's a little bit down the slope, because that might introduce a little bit more of a challenge. There's going to be some weeds that are going to perform better in those areas down the slope. Again, going back to that, weed management hasn't existed, seed bank be depleted. So after you control all weeds, there's going to be some seeds in the soil that are still viable. So you want to make sure that most of them have germinated and you kill them on time. And then crop residue on the top of the soil is a good thing to have. It prevents erosion. It keeps that soil in the soil. But you can actually have too much to the point that your seedlings are not seeing the sunlight. So that's one thing that you can also manage. And then fertilization, either if you have an established pasture or you're trying to reseed an area, you need to base it on a soil test only and not just fertilize because you think that's gonna help your plants, because often, especially in dry land, that's gonna benefit your weeds first. So you're just feeding your weeds before you're feeding your grasses. Nitrogen is one thing that you only want to do after plant establishment, again, because if you're putting nitrogen in the soil without needing it, then you're just feeding your weeds. And so the addition of nitrogen is not recommended on partial renovation because of the same reason. And then phosphorus and potassium is going to be probably the one thing that you may or may not need to add. They're not very mobile in the soil, so you probably want to incorporate it or use it when the plants are being established so that they can grow. These two elements help plant roots develop a little better, so that might be a thing that you would have to add. And then if you graze your pastures, or even if you try to mow your pastures, big question often is how long before I can graze? And the answer for that is if you're establishing a pasture, wait till the roots are established. In dry land, it takes about 3 to 5 years. It may be less if you have very good rain that year, but it's usually between 3 to 5 years that you cannot count on that field for grazing. And then in general, I guess, if you already have an established pasture or if you're trying to establish it, you have to wait until the grass is about 6 to 8 inches, depending on the type of grass that you have, and then remove animals or stop mowing when it's half of its height. So the main takeaways after this, I think, would be if you have an established pasture that you're trying to make healthier and make it more thick, then changing management, it's probably a good renovation technique before having to reseed the whole field. So sometimes changing that grazing management and doing rotational grazing can do a lot more than just trying to recover everything and reseed everything. And then if you are trying to establish a new pasture, just make sure that you study your land first and know what your limitations are in terms of temperature and soil type, weather, frost period, and things like that. So make sure that you know your land first so that you know what you're putting into and that it's going to succeed. So thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, I'm here. And here's a few resources that you can access. We have a newsletter. There's a website for small acreage management, and you can download the Colorado Forage Guide. If you're not familiar with it, it has a lot of those grass species that are commonly grown for feeding animals, and it will give you a good guidance on what to choose. So thank you.
So Steve has a mic, and we're going to ask, if you use the mic, Steve, there's a question up here. Yep.
Yeah.
Because we're recording this, so you'll have access to it afterwards. And our tech person said if you don't talk in the mic, we can't hear your question. I guess his question was he just wanted to look at the other slide. So.
For someone who's starting out, what's a good tool for tilling?
Oh, that's a good question. John.
Be a small disc, or?
I would recommend something that can do a little bit of a more shallow tillage. I'm trying to think.
How big a property are you doing?
Was that?
What size property are you doing?
Oh.
What's that? What size property? Oh, I'm thinking about the small horse owner. I have 200 acres, so I have equipment. But someone with a small acreage and they're just getting started, they don't want to go out and buy a rotor tiller
Right.
on the back of their tractor. So I'm thinking like a 6-foot disc maybe, or something like that would be affordable.
Yeah, or it's something that does very shallow tillage. Sometimes if that's not something that people want to go out and buy, probably just dragging a chain or something like that would do enough to disturb the soil on the top and have breaking down a little bit of that soil surface. So it depends on what's available, I guess.
I was thinking trying to get it 2 inches deep, though, you have to break it up pretty good.
Yeah, that's true.
Any other questions?
There.
I have a field that hasn't been grazed for decades, but it's depleted and thin because of long-standing drought and then the rains taking all the organic matter away. So I'm thinking of fall cover crop
Mm-hmm.
and then seeding in the spring. Do you have thoughts or experience with that?
Are you planning on just putting that cover crop on top of what you already have, or just changing it all up?
Seed drill.
Okay.
No, it would not be removing what's there. It's fine.
Yeah, I mean, it can be tough because of a lot of the cover crops may need a little bit more irrigation than what you may have. I don't know what area you're at, but some of the cover crops may need a little bit more water than your native grasses, so that can be an issue, but it's not impossible. I've seen winter or cereal rye that grows pretty well on dry land. So that should be good enough for you to get some of those nutrients back into the soil and break down some of that soil surface, and then you can go in with a different or the same type of grass on top of that residue after that cover crop.
A point I want to make is that if you go to the Pawnee Buttes seed website, they have amazing information on the different grasses and mixes and growing conditions.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good, I like their website a lot. They are specific in terms of what precipitation you may need for type of seed and things like that. So that's definitely a good place to check if you're looking for options. So.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah.